This video is going to be a demonstration, in part, of how libertarians are not just followers of Ayn Rand, and in fact, Ayn Rand and her actual followers, objectivists, are not too fond of libertarians, especially the more extreme libertarians such as myself, anarcho-capitalists, people who believe that not only should we privatize the roads and the healthcare industry and the schools, we should also privatize the police and the courts, and the process of making laws should be done by the market as well. This is a position that Ayn Rand was famously very strongly against, and now her modern counterpart, the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, Yaron Brook, has been making some comments about anarcho-capitalists, and so in the interests of demonstrating the contrast between libertarians and objectivists, the followers of Ayn Rand, and also in the interest of responding to some potential criticism of my worldview, I'm going to respond to these comments. So here's the video in question. It is how anarcho-capitalism defaults to civil war. So let's take a look at his comments, shall we?
Interested in the point you raised about anarchy there. What do you make of anarcho-capitalism as a philosophical movement, as it was promulgated by people like Rothbard? Do you think that the idea of a stateless society driven by property rights, markets, that some libertarians in America would very much like to become reality still, is simply implausible? Or
before he jumps into that, I'd like to say I don't know who this questioner is, but that was a pretty good description of anarcho-capitalism. It wasn't just like the people who oppose there being any law and order, which is a lot of people will say is what anarcho-capitalists believe. So thank you for not strawmanning us, random guy, random objectivist, I assume. You've done well so far. Hopefully Yaron Brook can avoid strawmanning us as well.
More fundamentally undesirable in some way.
And just because I paused in the middle there, that's also a good way of asking the question. Is it implausible or undesirable? Because when you're an anarcho-capitalist arguing with people who oppose that system, they will often oscillate between those two positions, saying, well, it would be great if we could have anarcho-capitalism, if everything could be done privately, but in fact it is not possible, it would collapse for one reason or another. Or, on the other hand, well, actually, we wouldn't want that, and these things, it's its own right and proper and good that it is done by the state. And those are two different positions, and which, in some phrasings, can be contradictory, so I think that's important to notice. So again, yeah, liking the question so far.
It's fundamentally undesirable because but it's a mythology. It's pretense.
Okay. I haven't watched this, by the way. I just want that to be clear. He just did both. He just said it's fundamentally undesirable and it's a mythology. Right? That phrased that way, it is not a contradiction. It's possible, but he's going to be arguing that it is both something we wouldn't want if it could come about and couldn't come about anyway. So it's pretty strong criticism there, Yaron. Hopefully you can back it up.
It's a rationalistic construction that cannot exist, metaphysically cannot exist. Let's start with anarcho-capitalism. You can't have, those are contradictions in terms. Anarchism is the negation of capitalism.
No. Anarchism. Not archos, ruler, no rulers. So anarcho-capitalism is not the negation of capitalism. You might say, well, but capitalism has rules, i.e. no stealing, which is basically the rule essentially the entirety of capitalism is just that rule. But it is still a rule. So doesn't that require a ruler? Anarcho-capitalists would, if you knew anything about our political philosophy, say no. No, we advocate for rules without rulers. The same way as the system of production in a market economy has no single designer. There's no one at the top saying this is how the structure of the economy shall go. Similarly, there would be, in an anarcho-capitalist society, no one at the top saying this is how the law shall be. It would be a combination of agreements arrived at by various different significant players within the economy. The same way as that works for any other good or service, law and order is a good or a service, and it can be produced on the market the same way. So, no, it is not a contradiction in terms to have anarcho-capitalism, because anarcho-capitalism, despite the fact that anarchy does oppose rulers, it does not necessarily oppose rules, and anarcho-capitalists do not oppose rules. Okay.
Anarchism is the negation of property rights. Property rights need an enforcement mechanism. You have to be able to enforce property rights.
Okay, so what government do territorial species of bird have? Right? I mean, territorial species of birds do have something that seems to be a lot like property, right? They will fight to defend this area of hunting ground or mating ground or whatever they're protecting, but not that area. So they distinguish between this area, mine, and that area, theirs. And between them, they have ways of making sure that in general, that means something. It's not just arbitrary in that bird's head. He's thinking, this is mine, and all the other ones completely ignore it. No, there's some enforcement mechanism such that this bird gets to keep this area, and that bird gets to keep that area. Right? So, territorial species don't have a government. So clearly, it's not quite that simple, right? That if you need enforcement, you need a government. Yaron is quite correct that you do need enforcement, but there's no reason that has to be through a government. To bring up one more point already, there is more private security right now in most Western countries than there are police officers. So already the enforcement of property rights is primarily not through the government.
And that enforcement mechanism is government.
Doesn't have to be.
If everybody is trying to enforce their own property rights, then ultimately there's no mechanism by which we arbitrate disputes.
Yes, there are. Yes, there is. Okay, so when two insurance companies get into their customers get into an accident, they will often have a contract between those two insurance companies specifying an arbitrator, so they can avoid going through the ridiculous government courts. The government courts in this analogy are like a war. You want to avoid the war between the two insurance companies, or if you're talking about rights enforcement, between the two rights enforcement companies. And so they're going to want to have some kind of agreement between them, bilateral agreements between pairs of these rights enforcement companies, and that is how the rights will be agreed on and enforced. And the market mechanism producing these contracts is going to essentially be how law is produced. Again, you're noting that government does some of the arbitration in our society, even though it doesn't do all of it, and then saying, and therefore without government we wouldn't have it. Like, imagine if the government was the only organization that produced shoes. They monopolized the shoe industry. And you said, well, without the government we couldn't have shoes. No, that's not the case. Right? Obviously, another company could produce it. However, beyond that, it's not even the case that the government has monopolized the rights enforcement industry. So we can be even more sure that there are other players willing to protect property rights because they already do, and arbitrate between property rights claims because they already do.
The mechanism that they present of private courts and private armies defaults to civil war, defaults to, because you've given different entities the ability to define property rights in different ways over the same territory, over the same property.
No, not over the same property. Over the same territory, yes, but within a certain territory, assuming we're using the word territory to just mean area, right? If you're meaning territory to mean property, as it would in like territorial species, like I used it before, then no, it's not the same territory. But if we mean just the same area, then yeah, it's the same area is going to have different rights enforcement agencies within it. However, it's not the case that they would be enforcing rights over the same property. There would be a dispute over a piece of property, and those two agencies would be absolutely at odds. The customer of one agency has a claim to this piece of property, and the customer of the other agency has a claim to that piece of property. Well, they could go to war. I mean, that's possible, but it's not a very good idea, right? The companies that are constantly going to war are not going to be particularly profitable. War is pretty expensive. And so the companies, just like in the insurance industry, the companies that avoid going to court are the most profitable. Similarly, the companies that avoid going to war, even more so, would be the most profitable because war is even more costly. So those companies would want to avoid going to war, and so they would have these contracts between them, which would say that in some circumstances we will rule this way, and in other circumstances we'll rule this way. That's a bit of a simplification, because most likely they would do what insurance companies do and actually go to a third-party arbitrator who's impartial and is going to be able to give a verdict that both of them can agree to. So yeah, agreement is more profitable than war, and therefore they will agree.
How do they arbitrate the dispute? They can
Third-party
go
arbitrator.
to court, but why bother? If I have a bigger weapon than you, why would I go to court? I'll just take you over and impose my view on you.
That would be the case if you were not only bigger than me, but you were also bigger than everyone else in the society put together, which even the government is not, right? If everyone turned on the government tomorrow, the government would not win. The government largely stays in power by tricking people into thinking that they need the government. So if you have a rights enforcement agency that was to say, well, you know what? Our customer might have been in the wrong. He might have stolen that item. However, we're still going to enforce his property rights, and when anyone out there wants to come and take it, you can just try, and we'll go to war with you. You could try to do that. However, that company's not going to be particularly profitable. Why? Because they are not going to have any agreements with any other agencies, because it's really clear that they're not willing to abide by arbitration. I mean, it's in the same way. Why would the insurance companies abide by the rules of an arbitrator that they agree to in their contracts? Right? The reason is, well, because they want to be able to continue to have dealings with other insurance agencies. Same is true for the rights enforcement agencies. They would want to agree to the ruling of an arbitrator and then actually abide by it, so that in the future the other guy will also agree to the rule of the arbitrator, and all the other guys who they interact with can agree to them for certain arbitrators and be confident that they will, in fact, abide by the rule of that arbitrator. So, yeah.
So it is a system that devolves into a Hobbesian everybody against everybody, all men against all men, and it revolves into violence. So, so capitalism requires, in order for capitalism to exist, what is required is the elimination of coercion from human interaction.
And in order to do that, we need a big agency of legitimized coercion. I mean, that's not impossible. Maybe it is one of those catch-22 things in reality, and we just, it sucks that in order to stop coercion, we need to do a bit of coercion. But I don't think that's actually the case. The burden of proof is on you to show that, in fact, your coercion is necessary.
And coercive action, whether it's private or whether it's by government, needs to be eliminated. Now, there's no way to eliminate private coercion without establishing a monopoly over the use of retaliatory force.
That carries just as much weight as saying there's no way to produce shoes without monopolizing the production of shoes. Right? The elimination of coercion is a private and a public benefit. It benefits the individual who has found a way to make an agreement rather than fight a war, because the agreement is more profitable. Agreements are more profitable than wars. And it benefits the society, because a society free of coercion is nice to live in and produces a lot of things, because people can be assured of their property rights going into the future. So we'll put it to productive uses, knowing that they'll be able to garner benefits from it in the future. So the claim that you need a monopoly over this service in order to get the service at all, it's just a non sequitur. No, you don't. Provide a reason why this service would be different from every other.
And that monopoly is government. And if they don't like the word government, call it something else. I don't care. But you need an institution, a human institution, that actually excludes, and whose whole job is to make sure that people don't use force against one another. And if you don't do that, if you leave it so-called to competition, there is no competition, because when force is allowed, in a sense, and now is competed over, then the guy with the bigger gun wins, just like...
Okay, so no, you said when force is allowed, force is always allowed in the sense that it's not prevented completely. Right? The government will fail to prevent all force. I even think that my private enforcement agencies and arbitration arbiters, I think they would also fail to completely prevent force in a society. I just think they would do a better job. The same reason that we would expect a government to do a worse job at producing shoes.
The guy with the best product wins, right? In a marketplace, the way to solve problems is to outcompete your opponent. And if...
Right. The way is to outcompete your opponent. And what is the service that a rights enforcement agency is selling? Well, it's security, so they need some physical ability to enforce if that were to come up. But they also need agreement with the broader society. Right? They need to have contracts with other enforcement agencies showing, look, these other enforcement agencies will respect us, respect your property rights if you're with us. So that's why you should sign up with us. That is also a product that is worth buying, and is also a product that you can produce on the private market.
Force is what we're competing about. Then the way for me to outcompete my opponent is to have more force.
Okay, you're not competing about force. You're not competing on who can use the most force. It's who can provide your customers with the strongest property rights, right? And the only way to do that is not force. That is not the only way that you can do it. Like I said before, if you have agreements with other enforcement agencies, that's another way that you can provide it.
Better weapons, bigger weapons, and to impose my will. You cannot have a marketplace, a functioning marketplace. You cannot have the idea of property rights enforced without an institution that eliminates the use of force, and that is called government. So,
okay, the government does not eliminate the use of force. This is really bothering me. The government initiates an enormous amount of force. The government taxes people. It steals their income. Civil asset forfeiture, wars upon people. The government causes an enormous amount of harm. It takes from people, it steals from people, it causes damage to people's property. It also erodes people's property rights in less direct ways. Rather than just stealing your property, it might tell you who you are and are not allowed to or required to do business with. Right? You want to exclude someone from your property, you may not be able to. Right? There's an enormous number of ways that the government erodes property rights. Okay, so don't tell me that that institution that protects property rights is called government. No, it isn't. The government, the institution that you currently acknowledge as the government, does not do that. It massively restricts property rights. And private institutions like security companies, etc., they do a lot of the protecting of property rights. In fact, more of the protecting of property rights than the government does. There are more private security guards in most Western countries than there are policemen. Yeah, I'll keep moving on.
I think it's a fantasy, but really what it is it's a consequence of philosophical subjectivism. Who is somebody else to decide when use of force is legitimate? If you deny objectivity, if you deny objective law, if you deny objective truth, then it's all about my emotion, my feelings.
I'll let him keep going.
And I want to be able to protect my property rights the way I want to protect it, when I want to protect it. And I want to be able to determine when you're violating my property rights. To hell with some objective court system. To hell with some means of objectivity. We don't have a marketplace in science. Science is not competitive in the sense of...
Okay. I'm going to respond to the objective law thing first. What on earth about a democratic process is objective, right? Do you oppose democracy? I mean, I do, but since you favor government, either you support democracy or you support some kind of dictatorship or oligarchy or something along those lines. But yeah, do you support democracy? That's not objective. That's just a whole bunch of people saying how they believe that rights ought to be enforced. And as we have seen, when you give people the ability not just to control their own lives, but to control everyone else's, right? Then they kind of fuck it up, as evidenced by the democratic governments that we see around us, right? And all of those property rights violations that they engage in, and I just talked about. So democracy does not give you an objective law. Well, how about a monarchy? Does that give you an objective law? the king, ordained by God, has declared it, so therefore it is objective. I don't think an objectivist thinks that makes the law objective. So, no, what makes something objective is that it is in fact true. That's what we're really talking about. And I would like the correct laws to be in place as well, right? However, we're not arguing here about whether we want the objective correct laws in place. We both agree we want that. The question is, how do we get that? One answer is democracy. Crap answer. Doesn't work very well. Another would be monarchy. Again, terrible answer. Now, my answer would be anarchy. It would be anarchy with private enforcement agencies and arbitrators who will determine property rights. Now, that is going to be based on a market mechanism. True, that's going to be an imperfect representation of the true and objective laws that we ought to have. However, because people, when they are buying a product, are going to get that product if they make the decision and will not get that product if they don't, they are more likely to make a rational and objective decision about which product to buy than if they're voting, where if you vote for one candidate or if you vote for the other candidate, personally, it's not going to make any difference. The vote will not be split by one vote, and so you're not going to, doesn't matter who you vote for, you're going to get the one that everyone else votes for, so you're going to make a less rational and objective decision. So no, a government is the furthest thing from an objective standard for things. A market is, again, an imperfect but better approximation of finding an objective standard for laws.
In the same way as
I'll go back a bit.
marketplace in science. Science is not.
We don't have a marketplace in science.
In the sense of
it's not competitive.
In the same way as as products are.
It's a great example. So therefore, right, we should have one all-powerful body which decides what the science is, what it is not, and refuses to let people believe otherwise. No, that would be a bad system. No, knowledge should be done on a voluntary interaction basis, right? It should not be this one coercive institution that you so love there, Yaron. Jesus Christ.
There's a different type of way in which we resolve scientific disputes, primarily through proof, through showing you in reality that it's true. And and that is the way in which science develops. We have a separate institution for science, a lab at a university that is not necessarily guided, that research is not necessarily guided by the same principles as, competition for a smartphone. And the same is true of law. Law is a science. To define property rights correctly is not an issue of competition. It's an issue of proof. It's an issue of figuring out. It's an issue of experts figuring out. And the institution designed in order to do that is government. And
no, it is not. The government is not designed in order to find objective law. It's designed to come up with law that will satisfy whoever happens to be in power. Right? That's who is in power controls the government, kind of by definition, and so it's their laws that will be placed on society. And now maybe that person who's in power is everyone, right? That might sound like a positive thing, but in fact it is not when you realize you're not talking about everyone having power over their own lives, we're talking about everyone having power over everyone else's lives. I don't know if democracy really does give that much power to the average person, but if it does, that's not a good thing. You don't want people to all be able to have the power to use the state to coerce their neighbors. Anyway.
And unfortunately, we've never structured a government good enough. The experiment has always been flawed. But okay, that isn't a sign that we should give up. That's a sign that we need to continue to refine our ability and improve our ability to design good government.
Right. Or we need to, because this is the important thing, you don't want government for the sake of government, you want government for the sake of enforcement of property rights. Or we need to come up with a better way to enforce property rights. There might be a group of people who have such a one.
And to have good government, Ayn Rand argued, you have to have a good philosophy. You have to have the right principles.
I
And
agree.
until we convince the world of our principles, there's no point too much in talking about government. The first thing is to get the principles right.
Okay. So that part I totally agree with. And the rest of it isn't actually Yaron Brook, so we'll leave it there. But yeah, pretty disappointing. I wish that Yaron Brook would debate an anarcho-capitalist and not one that nobody's ever heard of. Come on, you can... David Friedman is still alive, one of the two progenitors of anarcho-capitalism, the originators of anarcho-capitalism, really, in its fullest form. You could either say it's Murray Rothbard or it's David Friedman. This isn't the first time that Yaron Brook has talked about anarcho-capitalism, and it's starting to become pretty clear that he's never going to read any of the work. He's not going to read Machinery of Freedom. He's not going to read For a New Liberty. It's just not going to happen. So I hope that everyone watching can, if you're a Yaron Brook fan, you can hopefully see that even if you still disagree with me, Yaron is not exactly fairly criticizing anarcho-capitalism. It is not subjectivism. It is not lawlessness. The one that really stuck out to me was that he said that they have these private institutions that they think will protect rights, but that's just competing over force. Whoever has the biggest guns is going to win. Right? That is the very first thing that anyone ever thinks when they hear of anarcho-capitalism. Please, for the love of God, listen to some of the responses to that. You at least go to the next step in the argument. Otherwise, there will be literally zero anarcho-capitalists who you will convince to change their minds through these arguments unless you deal with that first step there. No, there are other things other than force you can use to enforce property rights. You can use agreements, arbitration, social pressure, market forces, things like that. Discipline of constant dealings, primarily. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough. I enjoyed doing this off-the-cuff video response. Maybe I will do more of them. We shall see. Bye, everyone.